This is Peter J. Redding at SignatureSeriesPens.com, returning exotic woods to and reminding you of your innate brilliance. This video is to experiment how to permanently affix my decals to my exotic hardwood pens. And so I've taken 8 different scraps that I have around my workshop. Each of these scraps is directly from a circular saw. There's been no sanding, no finishing, no nothing on these. And I worked through, as you can see, the 8 teak, purple heart, ipe, ironwood, marblewood, a shisham, brown heart, and a bubinga. These are the decals that, if you saw my previous video, you saw how I made these. If you haven't viewed that, I go through a step-by-step process on how to actually create really spectacular decals. And so I won't go into that here, but I'm showing these in terms of a micrometer doesn't even pick up the thickness of these things because they're so thin. And the question then becomes, how do I get that to stay on a piece of wood that I've finished with an oil-based friction finish, and which I think is a more natural look, a more natural feel for the pen itself. And so this is my first experiment into that. The Doctor's Woodshop Pens Plus is, I love this stuff. It's, I just put it in a smaller bottle there just to have it easier to work with. And because I don't have these on the lathe, I'm going to apply this liberally to each of these different samples. And then just basically smear it in with my finger to give it a really good finish. Let it penetrate for a while. And again, because I don't have the friction finish on the lathe, get the heat up, I actually go in to use my heat gun. Put it on high and basically almost bring it to a boiling point. Just, if you can see it start bubbling on top of each of the samples that I've got there. And I basically go through this process 3 times, which is the recommended applications of this friction polish, is to put it on a pen as I'm finishing it after I go through all the sanding and everything, which of course, like I said, I have not done with these samples, and go through that 3 times to get the best facsimile of what would happen. You can see the shine there. This is just after the 3rd application, and I'm just going to let these sit overnight and allow it to dry before I start applying the decals to it. So this is sort of like the base, an approximation of the base that I would have on a pen on my lathe. So here we are a day later, and you can see beautiful finish even for a non-sanded surface. And it's hardened at this stage too. This is it's all hardened and fresh. So I take I think that's a 2000 grit that I was using, and again just smooth out the finish because I was applying it with my finger and wasn't necessarily smooth, and just a little bit of sandpaper on each of these samples brought it down to frankly a pretty clean, flat, smooth, polished surface. The shisham, beautiful. It's a Delbergia family. I got that from India when I was over there about a year ago. Okay, so here are the decals, and what I've done now is I've just cut them up into a little square. I normally trim them up, but for an experiment, I just left them a square. And I spray the back of the decal with a temporary rubber spray. And in order to do that, I put it on the back. I use a post-it note that I've cut up into strips. The post-it note sticky part will go on the glossy part that you're looking at right now, because the decal itself is underneath the Mylar film. So, and I've just put it onto the purple wood there, or excuse me, Purple Heart. And there's so many issues with putting this on a blank. There's heat, there's friction, it could be accosted by the finish that I'm using, whether it's a shellac or a CA or another type of a finish. So there's the back of it there. You can see it's sort of opaque. That's the rubber spray that I've put onto it to affix it to the wood itself. And each of these are going on really nice. But the other issue then, in terms of after this, again, is going to dry and stay on there, and I press it in as best I can with my fingernail to make sure that all the air pockets are missing or gone or pressed out of it. With a normal decal, the Mylar would come off, but I want to keep the Mylar on there to protect the decal itself from the causticness of, like I say, the friction, the heat, the chemical reaction that the CA has on it. So I've been experimenting with keeping the Mylar on because it is so thin. But then the next issue is, what can I put on top of it that will allow it to permanently be part of the pen? Number two is to not have it look like a glaring square like you see there in some of these shots, as I've just put on the decal without anything on top of it, so that it blends into the final finish of the pen. So I'm going to take a couple of these and use a particular brand of CA, and the one I'm using there is from Scotch, like as in Scotch tape. It's a Scotch brand, and if you look at that applicator, which is very unique, it's the only one I've seen that has it. I can actually see through it as I've brushed that CA onto the top of that. Marblewood actually was the one that I started with there. I'm on the Shisham now, which is a Delbergia Ciso. And I'm making sure that I'm going over it smoothly, as well as over the edges of the decal itself. And hopefully not too much more than that. So to mitigate anything that I need to do afterwards to blend it into the rest of the finish. The second CA glue that I use is from Harbor Freight. It comes in these little tubes. It does not have an applicator other than the little nozzle that most of them have, so I'm just using that to kind of spread it around. This is on the Ipe. It's a very thin piece of Ipe, so probably not the best sample to start with, but hey, it's an experiment. This wood here is a Indian ironwood, or Ceylon ironwood that I got again in Mumbai, India. Very, very hard but beautiful wood to work with and polish. And so you see at least this stage of the experiment for each of the woods, all the decals went on beautifully. They are clean, clear. There's been no degradation based on the underneath of the friction polish finish that I had on it. And I've marked the two that were done with the Scotch brush CA It's a little bit thinner in viscosity. And the two there to the left of those that were done with the Harbor Freight. Stay tuned for part 2 of experiment number 1. This is Peter J. Redding at SignatureSeriesPens.com, returning exotic woods to and reminding you of your innate brilliance.